I'm good.
We'll stop and do the second movie.
Do I need to get my phone out?
Might want to. Parkinson's is kicking in.
All right, so the first one is a nerve versus a neuron. A nerve, like this spinal nerve here, a nerve is thousands of neurons. And you can actually see a nerve right here. Right here you can see a nerve. All right, that's a nerve. Because if I look in here, first of all, it pulls out a fascicle. And then out of the fascicle, it pulls out one axon, and here it is. So this is a nerve. It has thousands of neurons in it. Now, because that's a nerve, thank you very much. Because that's a nerve, we have an architecture similar to the muscle architecture you learned in 203. Remember how the muscle had an endomysium, a paramysium, and an epimysium? Same thing. We have an endomysium surrounding each axon. It's right here. It's actually right there. And there's even a better endomysium. And it's probably the endomysium I'm going to test you on. And it goes to this. I'll bring it over to you, don't worry. It goes to this neuron. This is likely the endomysium I'm going to test you on. Oh, I'm sorry, endoneurium. I do mean endoneurium. We have an endoneurium I'm going to test you on. It's not a muscle, it's a nerve. It's not mesium, it's neurium. We have an endoneurium right here. It's the gray stuff. So similarly, back in the muscle chapter, we had an endomysium surrounding each myofiber. Now we have an endoneurium surrounding each axon. That gray stuff's an endoneurium. On this model, you can see the endoneurium right here. Right?
So it's right outside the myelin sheath?
Right outside the Schwann cell. It surrounds the Schwann cell. Then we have a bundle of axons. And you can see that this whole bundle of axons is pulled out of this nerve. This bundle of axons is called a fascicle. Just like in the muscle where we had a paramysium surrounding the fascicle, in the nerve we have a paraneurium surrounding the fascicle. This is the paraneurium surrounding the fascicle right there. Paraneurium right there. Surrounding that fascicle, paraneurium. And then you can see that the nerve has a bunch of fascicles in it, and there's an epineurium surrounding the entire nerve, just like there was an epimysium surrounding the entire muscle in the muscle chapter. So the architecture of a nerve is similar to the architecture of a muscle. There is an epineurium surrounding the nerve, there is an epimysium surrounding the muscle. There's a paraneurium surrounding the fascicle of the nerve, there was a paramysium surrounding the fascicle of the muscle. There's an endoneurium surrounding each axon, there was an endomysium surrounding each myofiber. So what you learned last semester is similar in the architecture of this nerve. Any questions about endoneurium, paraneurium, epineurium?
What's the epineurium cover?
The entire nerve, that entire nerve right there. So I realize that it's kind of weird to go from the two-dimensional picture to the three-dimensional model. But if you look at this close, you can see what they're doing is they're pulling out of this nerve a fascicle. And they're pulling out of the fascicle one axon. And then they're blowing it up into a three-dimensional neuron that shows you right here. So just follow this architecture as you do this. All right. Now, I have several models I could use for the next part. Next. Let's see what the next word is. Now, right here at the fusion of my ventral root and dorsal root is the spinal nerve. Right there is the spinal nerve. Right there is the spinal nerve. It's the fusion of my dorsal root and ventral root. It's short-lived, meaning it bifurcates pretty quickly. So that spinal nerve right there bifurcates. And here's the dorsal ramus of my spinal nerve. It goes backwards. Here's the ventral ramus of my spinal nerve. You're going to say to me, Kiggins, it doesn't go forward. It kind of keeps going straight. You're right. But the dorsal ramus does come back, and the ventral ramus just kind of keeps on going out straight. So here's the spinal nerve. Here's the dorsal ramus of the spinal nerve. Here's the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve. Yes, ma'am.
So I got confused looking in the book at that. Like, does the motor part and the sensory part each have like a ramus, a ventral and dorsal ramus?
No. This dorsal ramus is mixed, sensory and motor in it. This ventral ramus is mixed, sensory and motor in it. The spinal nerve is mixed, sensory and motor in it. However, these rami communicantes are predominantly motor, autonomic motor, sympathetic autonomic motor. All right? And you'll see that, and I'll say that again in a second. So before I say all that again, any questions about the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus? You can say anterior ramus and posterior ramus.
Can you just say it one more time?
Yep. So do you see my ventral root and my dorsal root right here? Where they fuse, right there is my spinal nerve. And here's my motor ones coming out the front. So right there where they're fused better be both. So it's a mixed nerve. That nerve bifurcates into the dorsal rami and the ventral rami. And both of those are mixed, by the way. There's sensory and motor in both of those. So dorsal ramus and ventral ramus. All right? And the spinal nerve is right here. Short-lived spinal nerve. Okay, now. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now let me remind you about something from 203. In 203, you'll learn C1 through C7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. C1 through C7, right there. Then you learn T1 through T12. Then you learned L1 through L5. Then you learned that the sacrum was 5 fused bones, and you learned that the coccyx was 4 fused bones. Now the nerves almost follow that exactly. The first exception is in the cervical region. There's 7 cervical vertebrae, there's 8 cervical nerves. Here's how it works. C1 comes out on top of C1. C1 nerve comes out on top of the atlas. C2 nerve comes out on top of the axis. C2 vertebrae. C3 nerve comes out on top of C3. C4 nerve comes out on top of C4. C5 on top of C5. C6 on top of C6. C7 on top of C7. C8 below C7. You're going to say, how come you didn't say C8 was on top of T1? Well, it is. But I chose to say it. C8 is below C7. And then from here on down, the nerve is named like the vertebrae and it comes out below. C8 came out below C7. T1 comes out below T1, T2 below T2, T3 below T3, T12 below T12.
Look at what difference this is with the C's, it just comes out.
Right, all these spinal nerves come out below their vertebrae, except for the cervicals. So how do I get it back in? How do I get it back? So if the cervicals are the exception, how do I ever get back to correctness where T1's below T1 and L5's below L5? And the answer is, there's 8 cervical nerves. So C1 is above C1, C2 is above the axis, C3 is above C3, C7 is above C7, C8 is below C7, C8 is below C7, T1's below T1, T2's below T2, L5's below L5.
So C7 has two associated.
Yeah, you can think of it that way, but well, don't think of it that way, because remember the cervicals, unless you're going to remind yourself that the cervicals are above. Is that how you're going to do it?
I don't know.
You don't know yet?
Not sure.
So the bottom line is there's 8 cervical vertebrae and only 7, there's 7 cervical vertebrae and 8 cervical nerves. There's 7 cervical vertebrae and 8 cervical nerves. The cervical nerves come out above their vertebrae. But what about 8? 8 comes out below C7. And then the rest of the spinal nerves come out below their vertebrae. Does that make sense? Okay, now there is 5 sacral nerves, and there's 5 fused bones in the sacrum, but there's only 1 coccygeal nerve. 1 coccygeal nerve, even though there's 4 fused bones. There's 1 coccygeal nerve. So let's add them up. There better be 31 pairs. 8 plus 12 is, right, 20. Plus 5, 25. Plus 5 fused, 30. Plus 1 coccygeal, 31. 31.
And the coccyx, is it at the base of it or is it at the tip of it? Like as far as at the end point?
Tip of it.
So the 5 fused and the sacral are on one nerve, or no?
The 5 fused sacral vertebrae still have holes.
Oh,
So this hole is below S1, this hole is below S2, this hole is below S3, this hole is below S4. We do have these that show you that. Look right here. This is L5 nerve, S1 nerve, S2 nerve, S3 nerve, S4 nerve, S5 nerve, coccygeal nerve.
You said that to yourself.
Yeah.
So would you agree this is L5 vertebrae? And this is the beginning of the sacrum. See L5 vertebrae? Well, that better be L5 nerve, it is. And then if this is S1, I realize it's fused with S2, but this is S1, that's S1. This is S2, that's S2. S3, S3. I'm trying to keep it on the movie.
Oh.
That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to keep it on
You're
the
gonna have
movie.
to turn it some. Yeah.
So, L5, L5. S1, S1. 2, S1. You got it?
No.
I can't see it. Right there.
There.
This is L5, lumbar 5. That makes this nerve right here L5 because it's coming out below it. See, that's the transverse process of L5. It comes out below it. This is the S1 nerve, S2 nerve, S3 nerve, S4 nerve, S5 nerve. This is the coccygeal nerve right there.
The one in the very center.
Well, I don't know if that's the phylum terminale of the nerve, so let's just say it's the nerve.
Okay.
That could be showing the phylum terminale for all I know. All right, so those are the nerves. Any questions about those? If you remember the vertebrae, you've got the nerves. No problem. By the way, on the quiz and the test, I obviously don't expect you to know the vertebrae anymore. If you want to call me over and say, Kiggins, tell me what vertebrae that is, I will. I'll come over and tell you what vertebrae that is. I'll do what you should be able to do, and I'll just count myself down or up, depending on when I start. But I'll tell you which vertebrae it is. This is not 203 anymore, so feel free to ask if you can't do it. Okay, next. You need to know these gray and white ramus communicantes again. Remember, the gray ramus communicans or communicantes is closer to the spinal cord, the white is further. So this is gray, that's white. This is gray, that's white. Any questions about that? You need to know it for needed to know it for today, and now you need to know it for next week again. So that should be a
And
given.
then, do we need to know, I mean, eventually, like, what they do? But
Yeah, in lecture.
we go over.
Yeah, I'll go over it right now. So here's what happens, folks. See this sympathetic chain ganglia? I think you had to know that, right?
Mhm.
This is the sympathetic chain ganglia. The autonomic nervous system is broken up into two branches, sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system is also known as the thoracolumbar because the sympathetic nerves come out of the TL regions. The sympathetic nerves come out of the TL regions, but they don't stay there. They come out of the TL regions. They come out of the ventral root. They enter the white ramus communicantes. They synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglia. The second neuron enters the gray ramus communicantes. And then it goes through my ventral root and out to the body. Or it might go upward and out. In other words, the sympathetic chain ganglia allows my sympathetic nerves to go up and out or down and out. So the sympathetic nerves go all over the place, not just thoraco and lumbar, but they start from the thoracolumbar. Then they can come into here and go up and out, or go down and out. And the sympathetic chain ganglia actually runs from my neck to my coccyx. Let me say that again. The sympathetic chain ganglia runs from my neck to my coccyx. So these sympathetic nerves can enter my sympathetic chain ganglia and go up or down, and then synapse and go out.
And then the gray and white are, what is that?
Yeah, the reason why these are gray and white is because this preganglionic neuron of the sympathetic branch, this preganglionic neuron that comes out the ventral root, enters my white ramus communicante and it's myelinated. And then it synapses in my sympathetic chain ganglia. And the postganglionic neuron is unmyelinated, and that's why these are gray. But remember, it might synapse here, then go down and go through this gray one, or this gray one, or this gray one. They don't have to stay in the same level.
So pre-ganglionic means before the ganglia, post means after.
You got it. So my preganglionic neuron is myelinated, and that makes these rami communicantes white. My postganglionic neurons are unmyelinated, and that makes these rami communicantes gray. The myelinated ones run through the white, and the unmyelinated ones run through the gray. My preganglionic ones are myelinated, my postganglionic ones are unmyelinated. And really that is a lecture thing, but I realize that some of you learn better when I combine the two and talk to you about both things. All right, so that's the gray and white ramus communicans or communicantes. Now, over here. You want to come over here? Okay. All of this stuff right here, sympathetic chain ganglia. This right here, sympathetic chain ganglia. It is the same thing that you're seeing right here. Sympathetic chain ganglia. Same thing. Now, it runs from my neck to my coccyx. So you're going to say to me, I don't see anything down in here. Well, you got to turn this around and you got to look in here. This, what color is that to you? Orange? This orange stuff. Sympathetic chain ganglia. All of it. Sympathetic chain ganglia. Alright. If that's true, and all of that is sympathetic chain ganglia, what are its names? Its names are based on where it's located. This is the cervical sympathetic chain ganglia, and there happens to be two big ganglia right there. This is called the superior cervical ganglia, and that's called the inferior cervical ganglia. Here and here. So this is the superior cervical ganglia. Michelle, what number is that right there? Right here, right where the stick is.
36.
The superior cervical ganglia is 36. The inferior cervical ganglia right here, what number is that?
581.
581. So when you look on your key, you'll see 36 and 581 match up a superior cervical ganglia and an inferior cervical ganglia.
And they're chain ganglia.
And they are part of the sympathetic chain ganglia, named by where they're located, cervical. But in the cervical, I have two of them, so a superior cervical ganglia and inferior cervical ganglia. Then, oh, before I move this, here's my thoracic ganglia right here. Let me put my glasses on and give you a number. Michelle, what's that number right there?
582.
582. 582 is my thoracic ganglia. These are my thoracic vertebrae. That's my thoracic ganglia.
Is there only one for all the thoracic?
No, I mean, there's a ganglia
Oh.
each level,
Oh.
but one of them's labeled. One of them has a 582 on it.
Oh.
They're not all labeled. They're all orange though.
Do they all have a name?
If you wanted to name them more specifically, you'd have to say T1 thoracic ganglia, T2 thoracic ganglia.
Okay.
But you would only one has a number on it, but they're all orange. You can see all the orange ganglia right there. Then we get the lumbar, and you have to look in here. Here is one of the lumbars, 382. Lumbar. Sacral, 383. Right there, 383. And then the coccygeal plexus, because these run down and then fuse. They actually make a loop at the bottom. They fuse at the bottom. So the coccygeal plexus is 384.
Could
All
you
right.
just point out the sacral ones again?
Right? The one with the number is right
That
there.
little dot.
But this would be sacral as well, right
Okay,
there.
okay.
All right? And that would be sacral as well.
Okay.
All right? So those, I just pointed out the one with a number on it. Realize everything in the sacrum area is the sacral. Everything in the lumbar area. I can only see one in the, maybe two in the lumbar area. And the rest of this is sacrum. All right. Any questions about those sympathetic chain ganglia? The cervicals, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacral. All right. Vagus nerve. You're going to learn cranial nerves next week. And you're going to learn cranial nerves this week if you start listening to chapters 14. The cranial nerves that you're going to learn next week, the vagus nerve is one of them. But here's what's important about the vagus nerve. Vagus means wandering. And the vagus nerve is one of two cranial nerves that leave my head and wander all throughout my body. The vagus nerve wanders all over the place. It goes all the way down through here. So I'm going to point you out the vagus nerve in different spots here. Right here on the esophagus and aorta is the vagus nerve. Matter of fact, 247 is the left vagus nerve and 249 is the right vagus nerve. Right here and here. These are vagus nerves. Alright? The vagus nerve carries about 70% of my parasympathetic fibers of my whole body. So you know that sympathetic is fight or flight. You know that parasympathetic is rest and digest. The vagus nerve carries most of my parasympathetic fibers. The vagus nerve carries most of my parasympathetic fibers, 70% of them. Matter of fact, you ever heard of the Valsalva maneuver? Anyone ever heard of that? Valsalva maneuver. Nurses will teach you this. The Valsalva maneuver, what? Uh-oh.
Yeah.
You've heard of it?
Yeah.
So this can slow your heart rate down. By the way, some people die from
Yeah.
unintentionally doing this maneuver. I'll tell you how they unintentionally do it. If you inhale a big breath and then close your mouth and don't allow the air to escape, but try to push the air out, that puts intrathoracic pressure in your chest because your diaphragm is raising, your internal intercostals are contracting and pushing your rib cage in, pulling your rib cage in. Muscles never push, they only pull. So it's trying to push that air out, but you're not letting it go out. So the pressure inside your chest cavity is increasing. That presses on your vagal nerve and your heart rate goes down because parasympathetic nervous system lowers your heart rate. Nurses will have you do the Valsalva maneuver to lower your heart rate. Now, with the elderly people, sometimes they'll sit on the toilet, on the throne, and they'll try to defecate. And man, they're constipated for some reason. And they're pushing. And they're increasing intrathoracic pressure because they're pushing so hard. And it fires their vagal nerve, it slows their heart down unto death. You can actually die from this when you're older. Say again? Good one. That was a good one. I'm not repeating it for the movie. All right. Why don't you, 3 plexuses and then we'll stop this movie and do 2. Now, there's 3 plexuses here. And I need my stomach and my heart. There's 3 plexuses formed here. And the gastric plexus, here's the stomach right here, and here's where it fits. The gastric plexus is right here. This is the gastric plexus. So this vagus nerve bifurcates into many, many branches and makes these plexuses. And here's one of them, the gastric plexus. Does it make sense to you that a parasympathetic nerve would branch and innervate the stomach to churn if the parasympathetic nervous system is rest and digest? Yeah, digest. Okay, so there's the gastric plexus. The next plexus is the esophageal plexus. You can see that right here on the esophagus. This is the esophagus. This is the esophageal plexus. All right, esophageal plexus, gastric plexus. And then the last plexus is on the heart and the aorta. It's called the cardiac plexus. And it's here, here, and here, right here, and all these nerves right here. And that's called the cardiac plexus. Those are the 3 plexuses, on the heart, on the esophagus, and on the stomach.
They control like the SA node and all that?
Yeah, they do. Actually, the sympathetic nervous system affects the heart as well, and the parasympathetic nervous system affects the heart. Matter of fact, without the autonomic innervation of the heart, the SA node would fire 100 times a minute. So why does your heart only beat 70 times a minute? Because the parasympathetic nervous system slows it down. Yeah, so they do affect the heart that way. All right.